Hello and welcome to this video in which we will review the 3 years of war in Ukraine, and we will focus on the achievement of the objectives set by Russia and on the strategic developments that have resulted from this war. Whether it's about Russia's military, political, territorial, geopolitical or economic objectives. We will assess the material and human losses of both sides and evaluate Russia's territorial gains. Analysis of some traditional Russian allies now supporting Ukraine. And so we will see what are the possible prospects for the war's evolution. Have you heard about this incredible story in which Russian spies all had the bad idea to register their vehicle at the same address? Which means that there are dozens and dozens of them who have been identified. They were in open databases from which removal wasn't requested. You might also want to keep a low profile. The internet spoils your tracks. And in what we call data brokers, they have thousands of servers all over the world in which they collect your habits on the internet, your banking activities, your health information, also professional information and income data. And all of this, it's going to be used against you. For Russian spies, of course, it will allow them to be captured, but it also allows for targeted marketing. You face phone harassment and receive hundreds of emails. Rates vary based on your profile. To begin with, we must objectively note that Russia has failed to achieve any of its pre-war objectives. The first was to denazify Ukraine, that is to say, overthrow Zelensky's power, to place a puppet there, or directly annex the country. Beyond this ridiculous narrative, Zelensky's support remains strong, with over 57% of his country viewing him favorably. De-identification also means de-Ukrainianization of the country. As stated by Russian information agency Novosti on April 3rd, the 2022-25-year plan aimed to eliminate Ukrainian elites, the re-education of the masses, deportations and forced labor, as well as the disappearance of the Ukrainian language. Ultimately, it's a complete failure, as the use of Russian is rapidly declining, with only 3% of Ukrainians now wanting Russian to be the country's second language. And a 20-point increase in the use of Ukrainian at home, with now over 80% usage throughout all of Ukraine. Another major goal for Russia, obviously, was the demilitarization of Ukraine. However, Ukraine today is much better armed than in 2022, with the strongest, most experienced army in Europe, and also a defense industry that is unmatched in the entire Western Bloc to deal with this type of conflict. Since it produces at least 10,000 kamikaze drones per day, and I'm not even talking about armored vehicles, missiles, etc. The last point made official by Putin himself is that Russia wanted to reclaim the territories it claims to be historically Russian, even if it's historically incorrect. With statements from July 2021, then from June 2022, Putin compares the Ukraine invasion to Peter the Great's conquests, but it's a failure. He claimed he could take all of Ukraine in 2 weeks, but 3 years later, he hasn't even taken Donbass, with a front that has been almost stabilized for 2.5 years. This map shows the evolution of the Russian occupation of Ukraine scaled to the size of France. And you see here the occupation starting from 2014. Here is the Russian progression from February 24th to April 30th after the Russians retreated and abandoned the north of the country. Be cautious with all the progress made from May 1st, 2022 until now. You can see that in 2.5 years, only a small blue square, equivalent to a third of French departments, was conquered in 2024. This means that at this rate, it will take more than 2 years to simply conquer only the Donbass. And obviously none of the 4 oblasts that were officially annexed by Russia have been completely conquered. On the contrary, the Black Sea is rather a Ukrainian military victory, since maritime exports have resumed and the Russians can't oppose it. And the Russian Black Sea fleet had to flee to take shelter as far away as possible from the Ukrainians. If we now take stock of the war on the military level, Russia is generally losing 2 to 3 times more military equipment than Ukraine each month. This has been the reality since the war began, with over 20,400 confirmed equipment losses to date. We are only discussing the known and image-proven losses, which amount to 7,900 for Ukraine. And in detail, there are over 9,000 combat vehicles, infantry and tanks that are destroyed, 2,300 tanks compared to Ukraine's 700, over 1,300 artillery pieces compared to Ukraine's 700, and nearly 300 planes and helicopters compared to Ukraine's 160. And we're only talking about what is proven by the image, so the losses are obviously even greater than that. The pace of material losses for both sides is now relatively stabilized when we take overall figures. This image compares Russian military equipment losses over a 3-year period. But when we zoom in on the last few months on the Russian side, and even on the last few weeks, we really see a strong decrease recently. In other words, they have decreasing material to send to the front for participating in assaults. When focusing only on the most relevant materials, like tanks, we observe two complementary phenomena. First, the decrease in the number of tanks engaged and lost. And in addition, we always have this aging of the engaged equipment, since the T-62 tanks and earlier now represent more than a third of the losses. And we're talking about tanks that were designed in the 50s. For the prospects of Russian military capabilities to renew themselves to continue to provide a material effort, I invite you to go see analysts like Haimas or Jean Pai, who do analyses in India with studies, situations, storage areas of Russia that it had inherited from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. These are totally open sources. They've made some excellent videos. This determines when Soviet stocks will be depleted. Here, for example, this graph is the disappearance of the artillery. From late 2025, the Russians will face severe water shortages in several regions. In Ukraine, it's rather the opposite. The loss of Soviet equipment, Ukraine's only pre-war supply, is more than offset by the arrival of superior quality equipment from its allies. The list of equipment received from these open sources is shown here. I will provide all the relevant links for your reference. But for both sides, there are also losses of civilian equipment, which are becoming increasingly significant. Historically, Ukrainians used civilian equipment on the front line due to lack of military gear. However, now the Russians are doing it even more extensively. And there, for example, you have the analyses of Andrew Perpetua, who does an incredible job looking at absolutely all the videos with his team. The count includes 4x4s, cars, trucks, and military equipment, as previously observed. When considering these losses, we see that in 2023, Russia was losing roughly 1,000 pieces of equipment monthly, over 80% military, starting from spring 2024. We see a desire to saturate the front with civilian equipment, which increases the losses. Russia loses over 2,000 pieces of equipment monthly, with civilian equipment exceeding 50% in 2025. So logically, if there are still as many assaults, but there is less military equipment and there is more civilian equipment being used to conduct these attacks, the human toll is catastrophic and it is becoming better known. The British Broadcasting Corporation and Mediasonia have identified notable information on the Russian side: 120,000 buried dead, 94,000 of which have been processed to produce the statistics shown here. When comparing these figures to India's cemetery graves, we realize that we need to nearly double the figures, meaning they have truly been compared, the known dead in an area and the number of new coffins, new graves. So they have again doubled this figure. That is to say, it is estimated that it is rather 200,000 people who have been buried, but to these buried, we obviously have to add the missing. A Russian Defense Ministry representative confirmed receiving DNA traces from 48,000 Russian families seeking information about their relatives serving in the army, of whom they currently have no news. Since Ukraine is returning these DNA samples in accordance with international rights. So the figure, obviously, it's the Russians who give it. And it is relatively similar to the figure of 50,000 requests that have been received from Russian families looking for missing persons. By calling the special hotline that was created by the Ukrainians, and here we see the distribution of requests by date formalized by Ukraine. And we also have in Russia more than 20,000 legal proceedings in the courts following the disappearance of a soldier. It's quite credible that Russia experienced a loss of 250,000 deaths. To which must be added the 20,000 deaths officially recognized by the former separatist zones, Luhansk People's Republic, Donetsk People's Republic, plus all the foreigners, more than a third of the North Korean force that would have been put out of action. And once again you have Anto Perpetua, who does a daily analysis of all the videos, and who visually proved the death of 18,000 Russians in just 160 days. Each time he publishes the complete list with the Excel file, database and links for each video in which you can see the material losses and human losses, proving, going to check, it's really an unmatched source. We've never had a war that has been so well documented. In addition to the 250,000 deaths, there are also numerous injured. First, in 2022 and 2023, the official budget of the Russian state had included 507,000 new disability pension applications. There are 90,000 new wheelchair users, 50,000 new sanitary chair users, and 23,000 new lower limb prosthesis wearers, according to detailed figures. And the problem, of course, is that Russia stopped sharing these figures for the year 2024. But when we look at the curve and the progression of the number of deaths proven by name, we see that 2024 is the worst of the 3 years of the war. In 2024, approximately 40,000 people are reported missing in this location. who have not yet been processed to determine the date of their death and add them to the curve. In total, 250,000 dead and 750,000 injured. These figures are absolutely catastrophic and dramatic, but they are conservative compared to reality, by actually taking estimates that are rather below what could be real. If we look at the Ukrainian side, there is a very specific project called UA Losses, in which they have listed more than 127,290 people missing, dead or prisoners since the start of the war. The distribution is shown here. And here we are dealing with almost all of the losses, because when we compare the cemeteries with this list, we have almost all of the missing people already listed. There are many local projects paying tribute to the victims. For instance, the list of posthumous decorations publicly available on Ukraine's official websites. And if we apply the same ratio of injured to the number of deaths, we would rather have 300,000 seriously injured in Ukraine, of which 100,000 are amputees. Ukraine has acknowledged 380,000 injured, but this only includes those seriously wounded with lifelong consequences, as some of the injured return to combat. According to the UN, 12,340 civilians were killed and 27,836 were injured, only counting the areas that are not occupied. While obviously the toll is infinitely more dramatic in cities like Bakhmut, which are completely razed, or also like in Mariupol, where the press company had counted more than 20,000 new graves by analyzing only a quarter of the city. But obviously it's physically impossible to go check, but we know there are more than 100,000 civilian deaths. It's worth noting that Russia boasts about deporting 744,000 children from Ukraine to Russia, including 29,500 children requested by their parents because they stayed in the liberated zone, such as cities like Kherson, where the children were taken away before liberation, and the Russians fled, taking with them the children from schools and nurseries while their parents were at work. So there have been attempts to negotiate their return, notably with African countries and Russia. Regrettably, she will not return the children to their parents. After assessing human, material and territorial factors, we can examine the geopolitical dimension for Russia. The attack on Ukraine resulted in NATO expanding by adding 2 new member countries. That is, the border between NATO and Russia has increased by 1,500 kilometers, while Russia's traditional allies like Serbia or Armenia have simply switched sides. In South America, there are really developments. Aside from Argentina, which has chosen to supply Ukraine with military equipment, including helicopters. In the Middle East, Russia has obtained a lot of material from Iran. But at the same time, there was a huge debacle with the collapse of Syria, which was one of Russia's 6 allies at the UN. While many countries are now making Russia pay for its support to Iran, with, for example, Qatar and Iraq, who have started to transfer howitzers to Ukraine, Egypt, which produces shells for the Ukrainians, Jordan, which sends air defense. Israel has begun sending Ukraine Russian weapons captured from Hezbollah. If we look at the African side, obviously Russia has managed to overthrow some local governments by supporting corrupt military officials. However, in places like Sudan, these efforts have failed, as Sudan has officially requested assistance from Ukraine. Sudan is now arming Ukraine, providing it with a large stock of ammunition, despite no overthrow of power taking place. For countries that have switched to the pro-Russian camp, the economic and security balance is worse than before. And the leaders of these countries see that Russia is not a reliable ally, since Russia has abandoned Assad. In Asia, China continues its double game by selling dual-use goods to both belligerents. That is to say, very clearly, Ukraine today would not be able to produce all these kamikaze drones if it did not receive the engines and batteries that come from China. And since Russia only represents 3% of China's exports, China is imposing more and more sanctions, simply to not lose the markets that are much more lucrative, such as the United States and Europe. The real new deep support for Russia is North Korea. However, it's not very impressive since Russia requested North Korea's assistance, not vice versa. With the supply of 3 million shells, equipment like howitzers or anti-tank missile launchers, there were ground-to-ground ballistic missiles. And also, obviously, the deployment of North Korean troops who are widely used as cannon fodder. I refer you to the previous video in which we had delved into this dimension. But aside from these 2 countries, Russia is rather in decline, with, for example, the cancellation of arms contracts that had already been signed with countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, India, with India and Pakistan, by the way, which also export ammunition to Ukraine. In Central Asia, the derussification is accelerating, as exemplified by Kyrgyzstan, which demanded to change the Russian names of villages in November. By 2031, Kazakhstan must abandon the Cyrillic script. While at the same time, the country signed a bilateral military cooperation agreement with China, which is clearly aimed at defending against Russia. If we finish now, after this unflattering geopolitical balance with the economic question, there are four major indicators that need to be observed. Russia's gross domestic product growth is forecasted to be 4% in 2024, except that this growth, it is caused by the use of the sovereign fund. That is to say, it empties the pockets of the savings they had made in previous years. And this sovereign fund, it is emptying at a high speed. The state also contracts loans with interest rates exceeding 21%, which is the central bank's key rate. That is to say, the Russian economy is even less attractive than the Zimbabwean economy in terms of economic prospects for the coming years. It's not going very well. Incidentally, the investments that Russia makes for defense consumables is not productive. For example, if we spend 10 million to produce a few missiles rather than building a factory, the long-term impact is not the same, since the money that was spent to create shells and missiles will not generate wealth in the future to be able to repay these loans. In the same way, if I pay one person to dig a hole and I pay a second person to fill it back up, it's pointless. But in terms of gross domestic product, it's a value creation since I employed two people, even though it serves no purpose. In any case, this notably leads to a weakening of the currency. You see it as the dollar now costs 100 rubles, showing the evolution over the past decade. The side effect is an inflation rate near 10% in comparison. In France, we expect 1.8% in 2024, following the challenging 4.1% in 2023. And the last parameter, when we look at the economy, is the balance of payments, with a continuous decrease in energy exports, which are 40% lower than pre-war levels. Both due to economic sanctions, but also because of the damage that Ukraine has managed to cause on the Russian production apparatus through its many successful attacks on the Russian oil and gas industry. The Ukrainians have struck refineries deep within the territory, as shown in the balance of refineries hit. The second export sector for Russia is its defense industry. However, the arms industry is a collapse that is accelerating with a decrease. Hold on, it's down 92% in 2024 compared to 2021, with order intakes at their lowest. This is linked to the underperformance of Russian equipment deployed in Ukraine. Many contracts have been cancelled and negotiations questioned due to difficulties delivering to certain customers because of weapon consumption. For Russia, to the detriment of those who were waiting to receive this equipment, but also sanctions that make access to spare parts more difficult. Some countries refused to accept Sukhoi 35s with entirely Russian equipment. They wanted to be able to have access to standard equipment as much as it had been promised. Russia no longer has access, so we will soon make a video about these military and economic issues. You will see there is an industrial dimension that is very interesting and long-term perspectives that we will delve into. The verdict is clear. Russia has not achieved any of its war objectives. It's a military failure with disastrous material and human consequences. The Russian army has lost its prestige and much of its equipment. It has suffered a serious geopolitical setback and its economy is on the brink of bankruptcy, to the point that today no one believes it. Russia may still advance in Ukraine and take the Donbas region, since its rate of progress has further slowed compared to the year 2024. So, let's be clear, Ukraine is unable to reclaim its lost territories and the future of both countries is mortgaged, particularly in terms of demographics. And logically, knowing that no one has won, a peace treaty must reflect this reality on the ground. Without a military victory from either side, there should not be a political victory for any of them. Despite this, leaked details from Trump's team's talks with Russia suggest the peace terms could be a political win for Putin, with a restoration of diplomatic and economic ties, notably through the end of sanctions. And perhaps even Russia would not have to repair the destruction caused, and I remind you that there are more than 200,000 buildings destroyed, 3,500 schools and 2,400 attacks on health services. These are UN figures, with 80% of the electrical infrastructure damaged. So, obviously, these conditions would allow Russia to rearm itself in anticipation of implementing the threats it regularly makes against Ukraine and other countries it covets. Russia could be preparing an invasion plan for the Netherlands, which involves obtaining an operational pause, to rebuild its army, recruit 800,000 men, produce thousands of armored vehicles per year, especially if sanctions are lifted, allowing the station's resumption towards Europe. Patrushev, Vladimir Putin's top advisor, made announcements late last year about potentially annexing Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Moldova, according to the speaker. Or even the vice president of the Duma, who calmly explains that the Baltic countries are destined to become part of Russia again. So the option would be all the easier to implement, as Donald Trump is apparently on the verge of withdrawing the American forces stationed in the eastern countries on the front line against Russia. The clear solution we have long advocated for is complete European defense sovereignty, including armament and nuclear deterrence. And for that, we will need two things: money and also quite a bit of testosterone in our leaders. But for the past 3 years, we can't really say that they have really overflowed with demonstrations in this area. In any case, the worst case scenario obviously is not certain. And me personally, on the ground, I'm coming back from it. I was in Ukraine last week. The feedback I got, I haven't seen the Ukrainians this calm militarily for a very long time. The air defense has improved with a significant increase in shells, reaching a balance compared to the past. And they say that the potential disappearance of American military support would not be the disaster, the difficulty they had suffered a year ago. I remind you that from November 2023 to April 2024, all American aid had ceased. They were short of shells. More countries support them today. European production is higher than in the past. Conversely, the Russians can no longer depend on the millions of shells they had previously received from North Korean stocks. It's only Russian-North Korean production against the production of Ukraine with its allies. The imbalance and suffering the Ukrainians endured a year ago, it wouldn't be as difficult today. So we'll meet very soon to see what's in store for the Ukrainians and therefore the Europeans. Knowing that a weakening of Europe may also be desired by Trump if he really wants to annex Greenland, as he announced, in which case a militarily weakened Europe, which would lose territory to Russia with the Baltic states and would lose Greenland to the United States. From Trump's perspective, it empowers the United States of America in the long run, which may align with his desires. In the meantime, do some weightlifting, stock up on mercurochrome, and invest your savings in the defense industry. I think that's it. 3 pieces of advice that might be relevant for the coming months. And your support in Ukraine, once again, a lot of help last year. When you donate for humanitarian causes, you can also receive super patches. I'll provide the links based on your donation amount. You have these patches like Burn Moscow, again with Little Napoleon. You have Napoleon III with the memory of Sebastopol. The patch of the Task Force Baguette, obviously the patch of the Frog Fighters in Fauna in Ukraine that you support, either directly by providing them with equipment, which can be lethal equipment,